In the cold breath of the 13th century, Europe was a continent chained by fear of sin, of demons, of the unknown that crept between the lines of scripture and superstition. The church towered not only over towns but over minds, whispering what was sacred, condemning what was sinful, and defining what it meant to be pure. And in this world, purity was not a virtue, freely worn, it was a weapon used to divide. For men were judged by their courage and deeds, but women, they were judged by their tongues. The slightest hint of defiance, the smallest murmur of wit or anger, could brand a woman as dangerous. They called them scolds, women who spoke too much, too loudly, or too wisely. To the medieval mind, a woman's voice was a thing that could unravel order itself. A whisper could ruin a man's reputation. A rumor could ignite heresy. But more than that, a woman who spoke was a woman who refused to obey. And so, in the name of obedience, silence became sacred. And to preserve that silence, men built devices not to kill, but to humiliate, to control, and to erase the voice itself. Among them, none stood as cruelly symbolic as the branks, or, as it came to be known later, the Scold's Bridle. The Scold's Bridle was born in the iron workshops of northern Europe and Scotland, in England, and soon, across the Low Countries. The earliest written records of it appear in the late 1500s, but its spirit, the desire to muzzle women, was far older. Blacksmiths were instructed to forge a contraption that could fit tightly over a woman's head, with straps of iron locking around the skull, cheeks, and mouth. In the center, a small, cruel piece, a tongue plate, would be pressed into her mouth. Some were lined with spikes that bit into the flesh if the wearer dared to move her tongue. Imagine the sound, the ring of hammer on anvil as sparks flew, shaping a cage not for beasts but for the human voice. Each bridle was unique, custom-made for its victim, some simple, others ornamented with grotesque masks of demons or animals, mocking the woman beneath. Often, a bell was attached to the top so that when she walked through the village, the people could hear her coming, the sound of her own shame announcing her in official records. The punishment was described as for the correction of troublesome women. In truth, it was a public ritual of domination. The condemned woman would be dragged through the marketplace or chained to the pillory. Her head would glisten with cold iron as laughter and insults filled the air. Children were encouraged to jeer, men spat at her feet, and the local clergy nodded in approval, for they believed this was justice. A lesson to others who might forget their place. But what crime justified such punishment? It was rarely violence, rarely theft, rarely anything that stained the soul. Often, it was simply words. A wife who argued with her husband, a widow who mocked a priest, a midwife who questioned church decrees, all could find themselves beneath the weight of iron. Some women wore it for an hour, others, for days. A few never removed it again, dying not from the wounds it caused, but from the infection of despair. The Scold's Bridle was not merely a device of pain. It was a message, a declaration that in medieval society, control was maintained not by swords, but by silence. And in that silence, the authority of men was preserved. Yet even as these devices multiplied, even as forges clanged across kingdoms, there was something darker that allowed them to exist, an idea buried deep within faith itself, that the female voice was the echo of Eve's sin. Medieval theologians often quoted St. Paul's words, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection." To question this was to question God. The church wove it into sermons, embedding it into daily life. Priests preached that talkative women spread gossip and discord, that nagging wives destroyed households. They told stories of saints who cut out their own tongues to avoid the sin of speech. Slowly, society began to believe that silence was holiness, and that women who resisted it deserved torment. This belief shaped the law. Town councils, influenced by clergy, passed ordinances granting magistrates the right to punish common scolds. In some places, the punishment was the ducking stool, plunging the accused into icy rivers until her voice froze to silence. In others, it was the bridle, the ultimate symbol of suppression. Men began to fear not witches or thieves, but words. And thus, Europe entered an age where iron became theology. But the story of the Scold's Bridle does not belong to the church alone. It belongs also to a society that found entertainment in cruelty. In the marketplaces of Edinburgh, in the small towns of Yorkshire, in the cobbled streets of Nuremberg, crowds gathered to witness women paraded in their These spectacles were not hidden. They were theater lessons for daughters and warnings for wives. And when the bell rang from the bridle's crown, the people would know that order had been restored. Still, there were moments of quiet rebellion. In some towns, sympathetic neighbors slipped water or bread to the punished. Records speak of priests who later repented, admitting that the bridle's cruelty did not correct, but only hardened the heart. And as the Renaissance dawned and learning spread, new voices began to question whether silence truly meant virtue. Yet, for centuries, the iron voice of patriarchy rang louder. Each Scold's Bridle told a story of its own. One preserved in the Tolbooth Museum of Aberdeen bears a rusted inscription, "Chasten thy tongue, woman, lest it be thy ruin." Another, from Birmingham, bears ornamental horns, symbolizing the shrew or scold as a beast to be tamed. The craftsmanship was astonishingly detailed. a paradox of beauty and brutality. Iron polished like jewelry, but made for degradation. The same blacksmith who forged a knight's sword might the next day build a woman's cage. And that is perhaps the darkest truth, that these devices were not made by monsters, but by ordinary men. To them, it was not torture. It was discipline, sanctioned by custom and creed. In their minds, they were preserving harmony. But harmony built on silence is not peace. It is obedience disguised as order. The device spread across Europe. In Germany, it was known as the Schandmask, the mask of shame. In France, Le Bride du Scold. Each culture gave it a different face, but the same purpose. By the 1600s, the Scold's bridle had become as common a punishment as the stocks. Town archives in Newcastle list dozens of cases. Anne Bid, for loud and clamorous tongue, said in the Branks. Marjorie Johnson, 4 foul words against her neighbor, bridled for an hour. None of these women were accused of witchcraft, theft, or treason. Their crime was speech itself. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, whispers of reform began to stir. Philosophers and early feminists condemned the bridle as barbaric, a relic of ignorance. But the damage had been done. Generations of women had been taught that words could bring iron, that thought itself could lead to pain. And so, silence continued, passed down not through laws, but through fear. Today, the surviving Scold's bridles rest behind glass, relics of an age both distant and disturbingly familiar. Their rusted curves still glint faintly, as if holding the memory of those who wore them. Tourists gaze upon them with morbid curiosity, forgetting that once these were not museum pieces but instruments of law and faith. The air around them still seems to hum with the faint echo of their victims' voices, voices that were never meant to be heard. And as the camera would fade to black, the narrator's voice lingers. In the end, it was not iron that silenced them, but the belief that silence was righteous. The Scold's bridle was not the only cage forged for the female body. Across the courts and torture chambers of Europe, new inventions appeared, each devised not merely to punish crime, but to enforce obedience. To understand why they existed, one must step into the mind of an age that believed virtue could be beaten into flesh, that faith could be proven by suffering, and that fear could preserve order where mercy could not. The Middle Ages were ruled by hierarchy, God above king, king above lord, husband above wife. Beneath that fragile pyramid lay the unspoken law that held it all together. A woman's duty was to obey. When obedience faltered, when speech became defiance, the world responded not with argument, but with instruments. These machines of torment were not crude improvisations. They were symbols of a civilization convinced that pain was purification. The ducking stool was among the earliest. It seemed almost innocent compared to later horrors, a simple wooden chair fixed to the end of a long beam above a pond or river. Yet its purpose was humiliation as much as injury. Common scolds and brawling women were bound to the chair, their skirts tied down, and slowly lowered into the freezing water before the eyes of their neighbors. The crowd would jeer as the woman gasped for breath. The magistrate would nod gravely and raise her again, only to plunge her once more beneath the surface. Each submersion was a sermon. Let no woman raise her voice again. In towns like Canterbury, Nottingham, and Edinburgh, civic records coldly list these events, sometimes noting that the offender did confess her sin of railing. It was confession by drowning. To a modern ear, such punishments seem the acts of sadists, but to the medieval magistrate, they were moral theater, visible proofs that authority still ruled the street. Public punishment taught obedience more effectively than law. When a wife saw her neighbor hauled through the market square, gagged or dripping from the pond, she learned the lesson before the lash ever reached her. And yet the ducking stool was only the prelude. By the late 15th century, as superstition deepened and Europe shuddered through plague, famine, and war, fear sought darker tools. The church, struggling to maintain its power, began to brand certain women as the source of calamity, witches, heretics, sinners whose bodies supposedly carried Satan's mark. The result was an age of inquisitors and instruments. Among the most infamous was the Iron Maiden, a towering sarcophagus of metal, shaped like a human figure, its inner walls studded with spikes. Legend places its creation in Nuremberg, though historians now debate whether the earliest maidens were truly used or merely imagined as warnings. But imagination alone can be a weapon. The idea of the Iron Maiden, a coffin that punishes speech and sin, haunted Europe's nightmares. Some accounts describe victims locked within while spikes pierced their flesh just deeply enough to draw blood without killing, leaving them to suffocate slowly in darkness. Whether myth or memory, the maiden embodied a truth about medieval justice. That spectacle mattered more than survival. Not all tortures killed. Many simply displayed. The shame mask, worn throughout Germany and Austria, turned humiliation into ritual. These were iron visages shaped into grotesque caricatures, long tongues for gossips, pig snouts for gluttons, donkey ears for fools. The wearer was paraded through town, bells jingling, laughter following. The pain was not physical, but social, the collapse of dignity before one's peers. Women accused of vanity, adultery, or gossip were the most common targets. The message was clear. A woman's face, once unveiled, could be turned into her own prison. Then there was the Pear of Anguish, one of the most disturbing devices ever imagined. Small enough to fit in the palm, it opened into 4 metal leaves when a screw was turned. Variants existed for mouths, for rectums, for vaginas, each expanding until flesh tore. Many of these designs appeared in later centuries and were used selectively during interrogations, especially under witch trial hysteria. The church insisted it sought truth. The device guaranteed silence. It symbolized how medieval law viewed confession, not as revelation but as conquest, the breaking of the body to prove the righteousness of authority. Each instrument reflected the same obsession: to control the female body through pain, to sanctify obedience through fear. From Florence to York, prisons and manors kept such tools as part of civic equipment. Town budgets record payments to blacksmiths. For the making of a brank, 2 shillings. For the repair of a stool, 3. The bureaucracy of cruelty was meticulous. Torture was not chaos, it was order given shape in iron and wood. Behind the forge and the courtroom stood the pulpit. Priests thundered, that woman was the gateway of the devil. In 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published by Inquisitors Kramer and Sp. It declared that women were more credulous and more carnal, thus more susceptible to Satan. Across Germany, France, and Scotland, its words became doctrine. Women who healed with herbs, midwives who delivered babies, widows who lived alone, all became potential enemies of God. The instruments of correction soon became instruments of annihilation. Torture chambers filled with the cries of those accused. Few confessions were genuine. Most were torn from the body through pain. A woman who refused to speak was stretched on the rack until joints snapped, or branded with irons, sanctified by priests. But still, specific devices were designed for women because their supposed sins were bound to their sex. The Pear of Anguish for unchastity, the breast ripper claws heated until they glowed, the Spanish tickler, dragging flesh from bone, each justified as a defense of virtue. The paradox of the age was staggering. In the name of purity, they defiled. In the name of faith, they tortured. Not every region was equally cruel. In southern Europe, inquisitors favored fire. In the north, humiliation. English law prized public exposure, the pillory, the cage, the walk of shame. German cities embraced mechanical ingenuity, turning torture into art. In all cases, though the victims were overwhelmingly female, records from Bamberg 1628 show 95 women executed for witchcraft to only 6 men. In Scotland, estimates rise to over 2,000. Behind each number was a name erased, a life reduced to confession and ashes. The psychological design of these devices was deliberate. They punished not only the individual but the imagination of everyone who watched. The sight of a bridled woman, the splash of a ducked one, the rumor of a maiden's scream, these became warnings carved into memory. Obedience did not need to be enforced daily. It was internalized. Thus, the instruments did their work even when unused. Fear was the most efficient jailer of all. By the 17th century, whispers of change began to circulate. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Beccaria argued that punishment should correct, not destroy. Yet their voices reached slowly into the villages where superstition still ruled. There, the ducking stool continued its grim service. Sometimes until the early 1800s, the last recorded use in Britain occurred in 1809, when a woman named Jenny Bridle was ducked in Leicester for brawling. The crowd still laughed. The law still approved. Civilization, it seemed, moved forward 1 century at a time. Meanwhile, the Museum of Cruelty expanded. Some tortures, such as the Iron Maiden, may have been later but their legends endured precisely because they expressed the truth of the era's mindset that control of women's bodies and voices was both entertainment and moral duty. Even after such devices disappeared, their purpose lingered in culture: ridicule of outspoken women, suspicion of midwives, the branding of independence as sin. The iron may have rusted, but its echo remained. Imagine now a small medieval town at dusk. The blacksmith's forge glows red. Beside him stands a magistrate, parchment in hand. They speak not of guilt or innocence, but of correction. The blacksmith nods and begins to hammer. Each strike sends sparks into the dark, each spark a future scream. The tool he shapes will outlive them both, a monument to the belief that suffering maintains order. When morning comes, it will be fitted upon another woman whose only crime was defiance. The crowd will cheer. The church bell will toll. And somewhere in the noise, a single thought will die. The thought that justice might mean mercy. Thus the machinery of silence turned. Centuries would pass before reason began to erode its gears. But even reason could not erase the stories whispered about those devices. Tales that traveled from generation to generation, growing more monstrous in memory. The Iron Maiden became legend, the bridal symbol, the ducking stool, folklore, yet each legend was rooted in truth. The truth of a world that believed pain could sanctify and silence could save. They called it justice. The narrator would murmur, as the camera fades over images of rusted iron. But justice built on fear is only another name for tyranny. When the flames of the medieval age began to dim, when science and reason slowly dawned across Europe, One might imagine the screams had stopped, that the age of the bridle and the maiden had ended. Yet the truth was crueler. The devices were gone, yes. But the idea behind them, the idea that a woman's voice was dangerous, her independence, a threat, endured like rust beneath the paint of progress. The tools changed shape. The iron mask became law, custom, and expectation. Silence, once forced by metal, was now enforced by morality. As the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, cities gleamed with knowledge and art. But in the dim corners of those same cities, the ghosts of medieval justice lingered. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the shame mask, they became curiosities, locked away in chambers of history. Yet every woman who dared to speak too freely, to challenge her husband or question her priest, felt their shadow still. The physical torture had ended, but social punishment remained alive and sharpened. A whisper could still destroy a reputation. A rumor could still cage a life. Philosophers wrote about liberty and equality. But the Enlightenment was not kind to women. Rousseau himself wrote that a woman's virtue lay in obedience. Others argued her purpose was domestic, not public. Even as Europe celebrated the birth of reason, half its population remained bound to silence. The relics of torture, the bridle, the stool, the mask became symbols of a different kind of imprisonment, the one no law needed to enforce. In 1791, as revolution tore through France, a woman named Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. She demanded the same freedoms men had claimed for themselves. For that defiance, she was executed by guillotine, not by iron bridle, but by a nation that still saw a woman's voice as rebellion. The echo of medieval justice rang even in an age that claimed to be enlightened. The tools of silence had evolved, but the logic of fear remained the same. And still, the remnants of those instruments survived in the public imagination. Museums began to collect them. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, the shame masks of Bavaria, the bridles of Scotland. Visitors stared, horrified yet fascinated, at the artistry of cruelty. Some questioned whether such things could be true. Others defended them as necessary evils of a darker time. But the danger of remembering without understanding is simple. History repeats itself, not in the same form, but in the same spirit. As centuries turn, the Industrial Revolution brought new power, new wealth, and new hierarchies. The iron that once silenced women was now forged into machines that defined society itself. Women entered factories, worked beside furnaces, spun cotton, and stoked engines. They gained a voice in labor, in protest, in print, but each step forward was resisted by the same ancestral fear that women with voices would unmake the order of the world. Newspapers mocked them as scolds and witches, just as their ancestors had been mocked in the town squares of England. The scold's bridle no longer hung in magistrate halls, but it lived on in words and laws. By the 19th century, the old devices had become symbols of shame, not for women, but for the civilizations that built them. Scholars began to document them not as tools of correction, but as evidence of oppression. Feminist writers of the era, from Mary Wollstonecraft to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, invoked these instruments as proof of how deeply fear had shaped history. Men, wrote Wollstonecraft, built temples to virtue upon the suffering of their mothers. And though she wrote in the Age of Enlightenment, her words might as well have echoed from a medieval dungeon. Yet the fascination persisted. The Iron Maiden, once myth, became legend. In the 1800s, German showmen displayed reconstructed versions in traveling exhibitions, claiming they were real medieval relics used by inquisitors. Crowds paid to see them, to shudder at their design, to feel, for a moment, the thrill of horror at humanity's past. Ironically, the device meant to silence women had become entertainment. The cruelty that once hid behind faith now wore the costume of curiosity. But among scholars, truth was more complex. Modern historians now know that many such devices were exaggerated or misinterpreted, their legends inflated by the imagination of later centuries. The Iron Maiden, in particular, may have been an 18th century fabrication built from older fragments. Yet the idea of it captured something real, the cruelty of an age that thought pain could purify, that silence could sanctify. Even if the maiden never pierced flesh, countless bridles, masks, and stools certainly did. Their victims were real. Their suffering was not myth. And what did all this cruelty achieve? Nothing but centuries of fear, internalized and passed down from mother to daughter, a whisper across time. Be careful what you say. Be careful who hears. In that sense, the medieval age never truly ended. It simply changed its armor. The silence once commanded by iron was now maintained by culture, by ridicule, by laws written by men, for men.